Being active in the Baltic Sea, the Gotlar and fjörn frequently interacted with their Baltic and Slavic neighbors just across the pond. Despite this reality, though, we don't actually have much evidence detailing these interactions. Again, this is indeed a common problem with history. Nevertheless, we do know that the Vindir, or Wends, were a diverse group of Baltic Slavs that knew how to handle themselves in battle. For that reason, they were able to elude the Danir, Gotlar, and fjörn, who made attempts to seize control of their trading centers. And the Vindir did have quite a large number of trading towns that have since yielded large quantities of Arabic silver, meaning that their trade routes were well connected. Yet, despite avoiding Norse occupation, they were still victims of their raiding. After all, famous Vikingar, such as Olaf Tryggvason, kick-started their raiding careers in the Baltic. Yet, their relationship was not all about conflict, for the 10th century settlement of Wollin has shown that there were permanent Norse inhabitants living among the native Vindir. Their groups obviously mingled despite the political squabbles of their respective elites. Unfortunately, there's even less to say, at least definitively, about the Balts of the East. I've used the Old Norse term Oistkilfir, Easterlings, to describe them here, but other more specific terms were used for their subgroupings occasionally, such as Kurir, the Curonians of Latvia. The generalized term, however, does have its own problems, since similar words often referred to Norse who lived east of Norway and Sweden, or Iceland. But naming aside, the Gotlar and fjörn were particularly active in this region as well. Even before 700, and thus even before the Viking Age, Norse were permanently living in settlements here, such as Elving and Groben, among native Slavic populations. In the Baltic Sea itself, there were a handful of islands with arable land that, while culturally linked to the Norse, each had notable quirks of their own. For example, the rituals surrounding death in these regions all differ from their mainland neighbors. In Åland, for example, the ashes of the dead were placed in a ceramic urn that was topped by a miniature clay bear or beaver paw. The most famous of these islands, however, is Gotland. And you've probably seen its picture stones on the internet before, but if not, there's an example right here, and you can see more if you interact with this map yourself. Despite their appearance, they're not actually runestones, but rather a unique type of funerary monument found only in Gotland and a few places elsewhere still connected to its inhabitants. They usually don't have runic inscriptions, favoring instead a highly visual approach, hence the name. Their fame today, however, comes primarily from the way they seem to illustrate scenes from Norse mythology and legend. Odin transforming into an eagle, Sigurd the dragon slayer, Gunnar in the snake pit, etc., etc. And it's okay if you don't know what any of those references are. You'll learn more about them if you stay in the hall long enough. Our last group, finally, is what the Norse collectively called the Finnar, which included both the Sámi and the Finns. For they seemingly didn't distinguish them as different people, as we do today. In their own eyes, the Finnar were closely associated with magic. Several sagas tell of Norse either traveling or being sent to them for magical instruction, hiring them to perform magic on their behalf, and occasionally marrying them or just sleeping with them. To provide a brief overview, they were the people of the drum, which was the sacred instrument and primary tool of the Noaidi, or shaman. They were a semi-nomadic people who either herded reindeer or hunted, trapped, and fished. Their spiritual belief was markedly different from the Norse, but likely influenced the Norse practice of seafaring, if you're familiar with that already. If not, it's a special form of magic. The extent of Finnar-Norse interaction in the north can't be overstated. As the example of Ottar demonstrates, the Norse frequently interacted with them because their borders often overlapped, as you can see here. To quote Neil Price, Quote, "These groups seem to have lived essentially side by side, sometimes in literal adjacent communities, with little sign of friction between them." End quote. Of course, there was a fair amount of friction, at least occasionally, since the Norse often demanded tribute from them, which would have consisted of furs and slaves. Nevertheless, it's clear that their relationship, despite political tensions, was quite fluid and complex, especially among ordinary folk. For example, there's a burial from Vivalin, Sweden, a Finnar settlement, wherein a male-bodied person was buried according to Finnar rituals while wearing a Finnar man's clothing over a Norse woman's linen dress. This example not only crosses cultural boundaries, demonstrating just how fluid such boundaries were between them, but also gender norms. In the end, it's obvious that these two groups mingled frequently, both peacefully and violently, which is very human, don't you think? So, what's the point? Well, let's review the big takeaways. Ethnic borders were fluid. Political elites may have paid attention to them, but most people crossed them to create diverse settlements, markets, and families. The Norse didn't have equal experiences. Arable land varied from one region to the next, which affected power centers, political unification, and one's reliance on animal husbandry for sustenance. Culture was shaped by the environment. Despite regional variation, the Norse collectively depended on ships and seafaring because of their landscapes. Likewise, the mountain-dwelling Finnar relied more heavily on herding, hunting, trapping, and fishing instead. If anything, those are the three most important things to take away from this lesson. You'd also do well to remember the major players: Norse, Balts/Slavs, and Finnar. They'll make frequent appearances throughout this course. But with that, I think we're ready to move on to our next topic, which is the history that set the stage for the Viking Age.